Hey everyone, welcome to Franc Analysis. I'm your host Franco. I am joined today by Kevork Almassian. It's an honor to have him on. He is a Syrian Armenian political commentator and founder of Syrian Analysis, an independent news outlet which has its own website and YouTube channel. Kevork, thank you very much for being here. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on your channel.
So, Kevork, from what I know, Syrian Analysis is completely independent, and its goal is to inform as many people about global affairs while also exposing the mainstream media and State Department lies about these affairs, especially the ones regarding Syria and Armenia. Could you tell us a little bit more about Syrian Analysis and how it got started and what the goal is for this?
Actually, I've been involved, let's say, in politics since 2011, since the eruption of the war on Syria. I had a perception, thanks to my education in international relations and diplomacy and later master in political science, I had some sort of, comprehension about what's going on in the region. So I saw or perceived this conflict in Syria or on Syria as a proxy war launched by NATO countries in order to destabilize Syria and change the regime in Syria in order to install a puppet government. So I was writing both in Arabic and in English for many years. But in 2017, before 2017, I was writing in, let's say, regular newspapers and working as a TV host in Lebanon. But then I wanted in 2017 to do my own work because I'm convinced now, even though my work was for outlets that are aligned with or close to the line that I believe in, but in any way, there are editorial lines that you should follow wherever you work in an outlet that you don't own, right? So I wanted to be independent and do my own work. And I was confident that there are a lot of people, especially in the West, who are thirsty of hearing a different perception and different point of view of what's going on in my country, especially that I come from Syria, from Aleppo, and we all know that the war in Aleppo was one of the biggest wars or battles in the entire Syrian crisis. So I have sources on the ground because I was underground in Syria a lot. I have friends on the ground who are covering the war, and I have colleagues, let's say, even in the Syrian army, because who is the Syrian army? Is my friends, are my schoolmates, they're my neighbors, they're my cousins and family members. This is the Syrian army. So I wanted to bring these voices from Syria into the Western people because the Western people are, at the end of the day, are voting for certain politicians, right? And their vote counts. And somehow still in 2021, some people aren't able to see the full picture. So I wanted to do this breakdown, to break the narrative of the Western mainstream media about Syria. Of course, I wasn't the only one. There were many people doing this, and I'm thankful for that. But because I'm coming from a Syrian background, it had a little bit more credibility, let's say. So most of my followers are coming now from the United States, which is a good thing. And I want just to talk to any American or Westerner, regardless of their ideology and background, regardless if they are left or right, because at the end of the day, this war is existential for us in Syria. And for me, it doesn't matter if the person who is understanding the war on Syria from the right point of view, whether he is a right wing or left wing, for me it doesn't count, because if you're left or right, you're in the United States. It's your choice. But in Syria, you have to understand that there is a big proxy war going on, and only today we have learned that the UK has funded up to $400 million only in the past few years on radical jihadists in Syria. And the Gulf countries were funding billions of dollars. So do you think all these countries are sending all these weapons and ammunition and money to Syria to establish a democracy? We all know that Syria is not a Switzerland-like political system, but it is much more advanced comparing to other regional countries, especially when it comes to the social aspect of it, that there was a very big tolerance and very big multiculturalism in Syria. So for me, it's very important to preserve this mosaic in Syria. Therefore, I defend the side that is willing to preserve this multiculturalism in Syria. And for me, it's I don't care who's the president. It's Assad, he's Ahmad, he's Hassan, he's George. I don't care the person itself, as long as he's carrying Syrian values and he's willing to free our country from for an invasion.
Yeah, yeah, and I thank you for the work that you do, and for giving us that perspective that that we really need. And I want to ask you about what you think of the overall coverage by, like, we know that the mainstream media is like really horrible on these issues, but I want to know what you think of the overall coverage by independent American media on West Asian countries like Syria. I personally feel like there is still an indoctrination in a lot of people who even consider themselves anti-imperialists. They still view this area of the world as backwards or a savage place. And I would like to hear you correct the record on the culture of Syria and other West Asian countries and how they aren't these backwards or savage places, but are really victims of Western imperialism.
Actually, the coverage is divided, like even among the independent journalists and, let's say, YouTubers on social media. Some people are more or less careerists. So they want to keep certain level of objectivity when they want to talk about Syria. So they're like two-siderism strategy. So, okay, we know that there is a regime change war on Syria, but at the same time, we condemn the war crimes of Assad against his own people. And you're like, if you say there is a regime change war, that means a proxy war. And when you say it's a proxy war, that means the people who are fighting underground are actually tools for American imperialism. And when the government is fighting these proxies, then he's not fighting his own people. He's fighting the tools of the masters, which is NATO, Turkey, Israel, United States, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries. So if you don't see the war in Syria from this perspective, then you are short-sighted. You're not really seeing the full picture, or you're just trying to be a hypocrite in order to like attract more following. Because nowadays, even if you want to be independent journalism, we know it's very tough to be successful independent journalist, and you need to have a big following base. So sometimes some people say, let me adopt this strategy, the two-siderism, so that I can attract a lot of people claiming that I'm an objective in order for me to generate more clicks and more money, right? So this is how I see, but there are certainly very good journalists in the United States, in Britain. I don't want to mention names now because I don't want to forget any names, but they were very brave journalists. Some of them were underground in Syria, and some of them were always suspecting the coverage of the mainstream media. So they were always questioning the events in Syria, and at the end of the day, because this was one of the biggest hybrid non-traditional warfare against any independent country. So people know that the mainstream media is lying. I'm talking about this independent journalists. So when they question the narrative of the mainstream media, and after a few years, they prove to be right, even though they don't really know the entire picture, or they aren't on the ground in Syria. But since you are aware how much the mainstream media is embedded with the establishment and their regime change war and the billions that they spent in Syria for many years, so you have to know that there is something fishy going on, right? Yeah. And I am thankful for these people for many reasons, because were it not for them, the narrative would not have been reshaped by only few individuals. This is a teamwork. There are many people working on it, and that is why nowadays we see nowadays, especially Biden administration is coming after Facebook, YouTube, and other platforms in order to limit the free speech in the United States, because the social media is now the place for independent people to shape or to reshape the public opinion, and it's not going well, let's say, for the establishment.
Yeah, a lot of people are waking up because of the how fast the information is traveling right now. But there are still channels like the Young Turks that are arrogant enough to think that they know more about what's happening in Syria than actual Syrian journalists like yourself, or people who are on the ground in Syria like Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett. Politically and militarily, I was just
TYT
gonna.
is not an
Oh
independent.
yeah, they're not. No, they like to claim that they are though. But I mean, politically and militarily, it makes absolutely no sense why Assad would gas his own people. But they had the nerve to bring on someone like Patrick Hillsman. Patrick Hillsman claims to have visited Syria and would sneak into it illegally from Turkey to eastern Aleppo between 2012 to 2014. And you explained in the video how questionable that is. So, would you like to explain that to the audience?
Actually, Patrick Hillsman was sneaking through from Turkey into Syria. So he was breaking in Syria without a visa, and he was illegally coming to Syria. And we all know between 2012 and 2016, and don't take my words, even the Pentagon said that there is a big problem in eastern Aleppo, which is Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda was in control, in charge of eastern Aleppo or the eastern neighborhoods of Aleppo. And Patrick Hillsman was coming from Turkey and passing through 110 kilometers from Turkey to the city of Aleppo. And these checkpoints are all in the hands of Al Nusra Front. And you know who is Al Nusra Front? It's the Al Qaeda offshoot in Syria. So Patrick Hillsman was passing through Al Qaeda checkpoints to arrive into in Aleppo and be in Aleppo trying to polish, let's say, Al Nusra Front and other jihadi terrorist groups. Patrick Hillsman, he doesn't have a single document or a single investigation or a single journalistic report that talks about the war crimes of Al Qaeda in eastern Aleppo. Al Qaeda and other affiliated groups have killed over 13,000 civilians in Aleppo with their mortars and with their unguided mortars and missiles, including my friends, my colleagues, and from my family members. We have lost a lot. My brother was kidnapped in 2012 because he's a Christian, according to these rebels, and they were going to decapitate him if we haven't paid them $12,000 back then. They wanted $20,000, but we negotiated with them for $12,000. So this is the rebel mentality people who were occupying eastern Aleppo, and Patrick Hillsman was there, embedded with them, and he has never reported anything about these war crimes. But on the other hand, even though he is coming to Syria, that doesn't mean he knows what's happening in Douma, because between Douma and between Aleppo is around 400 kilometers, and he never been into Douma. He never went into Douma, and when the alleged chemical attack happened, he wasn't there. In 2018. He was not even in Syria back then. But all of a sudden, if someone, this is really funny, somebody marries a Syrian woman, he becomes an expert on Syria, and somebody sneaks into Syria, he becomes an expert on Syria. And somebody being like 20 years ago a tourist for 3 days in Damascus, he becomes an expert on Syria. It became a really silly and ridiculous thing nowadays. And Patrick Hillsman, he didn't add anything added value to the to his during his participation on the TYT. The whole point was, like, Patrick Hillsman, Anna Kasparian said he's a journalist from Syria.
And he even admitted that he's not.
He's not.
Yeah.
He wasn't. But then she said he was based in Syria, and he said, no, I wasn't based in Syria. I was in Syria. So this guy is a sham, and I mean, I've had a lot of tit and tats, like a ping pong on Twitter with him when he was in Aleppo. And I challenged him many times, like, dude, you're in eastern Aleppo now. Aren't you seeing these Al Qaeda maniacs? And he's like, no, there are no Al Qaeda maniacs. Aren't you seeing the people are being forced to go to prayer? If you don't go to the mosque on Fridays to pray, you will be lynched in the street. All are documented by videos, and I have them in my archive. I save all these things for the future, you know. He hasn't seen any of this. He's just there to give, to attack the government and to give legitimacy to these radical rebels there. So I raised the question: who sent Patrick Hillsman to Syria, right? Like, why is he going there? If he isn't generating any money, then who is paying for him? How is he traveling? How is he paying all these expenses to come to Syria? It's not for free, right? To come from the United States to Turkey. So all these questions we need to ask. What was his mission? Who was paying this guy? Apparently, it's a very complicated, and we will not reach into answers easily. But I would not believe a word this guy says. And the shameful thing is for Anna Kasparian, I will always mention this. Anna Kasparian is an Armenian. First thing, she works for a channel called The Young Turks. The Young Turks are the main perpetrators of the Armenian genocide against my ancestors and her ancestors. And secondly, she is defending a so-called revolution who openly, clearly, if you understand Arabic, you just need to go to their social media websites and see what they say. We are coming to slaughter you, O infidels. They say the infidels are us. Like we are disbelievers for them. So they're coming to slaughter us. And she's on the side of these people. So for a second ethnic cleansing, not only against the Armenians this time, but any Syrian who holds a Syrian identity. And when I say holding Syrian identity, not everyone carries a Syrian passport means he carries a Syrian identity. Some people who rose against the government, they feel and think they're more Turks than Syrians. And it's not like I'm evaluating them. They say this, like they believe that Erdogan is their president because their identity, the macro identity in this regard, is an Islamist. Because Erdogan is claiming that he is the ruler, the caliph of the Ummah, the Islamic Ummah, etc., etc. He is attracting all these brainless people with him. Tens of millions of people follow Erdogan nowadays, unfortunately. So we have to see things from this perspective. Otherwise, a clown like Patrick Hillsman will come and say, like, this was a popular revolution against a tyrant.
Yeah, and speaking of clowns, there's other people that, not just TYT, but there's other people with big influences like Vash, who Jackson Hinkle debated about the OPCW and Duma report. And Jackson, he clearly had the facts on his side, and he was able to dismantle a lot of the lies that Vash was saying. However, one of the things he agreed with Vash on was that Assad is a brutal dictator. And I've said on my show how that is a State Department talking point that manufactures people's consent into Western intervention. And he made a response video to what I said, doubling down on Assad as a brutal dictator without any receipts. He said that he is still against intervention. However, the Young Turks say that's the same thing after they regurgitate State Department talking points. And like I had my issues with Jackson in the past. We worked it out. We're in good terms right now. Like there's no like conflict right now between us. And I've even invited him on, but I still wanted to discuss this with a Syrian who I have on the show right now. So this is Vanessa Beeley. She pointed this out. She quoted what Jackson said regarding Assad, like what he said. And then she said Jackson might like to refine his CIA talking points by actually interviewing Syrians. And then she tagged yourself. She tagged you. And she said, after 10 years of war, terrorism, economic savagery, apparently the Syrian people voted in their millions in 2014 and 2021 for a brutal dictator who has done disgusting things to them. These arguments lack any integrity, evidence, or context. They sustained the war against Syria. And then she tagged me and thanked me for my integrity and for interviewing people who have actually spent extensive time in Syria with Syrian people. Like I've had Vanessa Beeley on, and we were debunking some of the Western media propaganda about Syria. And Eva Bartlett also weighed in, and she asked where he gets his information from. And she said, or do facts and sources even matter? Is it more of, if I say the right cliche, I'll be seen as credible? If he said this in Syria, Syrians would laugh in his face. So, I mean, despite this, though, he won the Serena Shim Award for uncompromised integrity. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on On what Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett said regarding Jackson's agreement with Vash about Assad.
Actually, I've been watching his YouTube channel for a while now, and I think he's doing a good job. Okay, I have
Yeah.
nothing against him, nothing
Yeah.
personal. We are here to do work and journalism. And when I disagree with him, I will say to his face, like, I disagree with you. And I commented to him many times. I followed him. Maybe he follows me back, so we could exchange messages and we could do a debate or something. But he never follows me back. So what can I do? Actually, it's very sad that this narrative about, okay, this is a regime change against Syria and it's an imperialist war against Syria, but at the same time, Assad is a brutal dictator and he created a police state. Some of the people who are saying these things, they were saying this in 2013 and 14 and 15 until today. And some of them went a few times to Syria. They have been into Syria. So imagine that there is a brutal dictator in Syria and you're calling him a brutal dictator and you're saying he committed war crimes and he's granting you a visa. And when you're going into Syria, you're cruising and walking free without minders, without any restrictions. Unless you want to go to a war zone, of course, you have to follow certain, let's say, guidelines, And they come back from Syria and they say the same thing. And nothing happens to them. So if there is a brutal dictatorship in Syria and you're going there and you're just spitting on the face of the regime and he's not doing anything for you, so how come this is a brutal dictatorship? And regarding the war crimes, so when there is a war and when you're shooting, there will be casualties, right? But it's very important to define the terminologies and define, to adopt international norms and law on this. So who decides this is a war crime or not? Is it Vaush? Is it, Jackson? No. There are courts who decide this is a war crime or not. Even Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they say they're potential war crimes. They cannot decide these things. This should be done through courts, right? This is number one. Number two, when you say, personally, you're saying this is an imperialist war on Syria, so you are already defining the opponents of Assad as being a proxy for NATO, for the United States, and for the imperialist forces. So when Assad is fighting back these forces, he's not killing his own people, knowing that they were over 100,000 multinational jihadists among these so-called rebels fighting in Syria. So when you have this situation, you have to ask yourself, first, is this a civil war or it's a proxy war? If you say it's an imperialist war, then you're already defining it as a proxy war, right? And when it's a proxy war, you're not killing your own people. You understand what I mean? But if you call it a civil war, then there is two sides or more. They should fight each other. But even if there are two Syrian sides are fighting, that doesn't mean it's a civil war. Let me explain. When one side, the rebel side, is saying we want to exterminate the minorities in Syria, they are actually declaring that they want a civil war, right? But on the other side, when the government is not responding with the same intention against these so-called rebel groups, and it is saying, no, what's happening in Syria is a proxy war, and these guys have been funded by the United States, by Israel, by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, and we are fighting imperialism in Syria through their tools. So they don't consider them at all to be a civil war in the first place. So these narratives, you can't really intertwine together. When you say it's a proxy war, then he didn't kill his own people. It's a proxy war launched by NATO. There were multinational jihadists from all around the world coming into Syria with the blessing of NATO, and Turkish borders is open for all the people from all around the world. But when you believe in this narrative, then you cannot really say that Assad has murdered his own people. And even though among these rebels there were Syrians who were fighting, but they were fighting from the standpoint that Assad is an infidel. Assad is, let's say, because they consider him an agent for Iran. they didn't fight Assad because he is a dictator. Because Assad, if you compare him with any rebel group in Syria, he's like you can't even compare between them. One side is an Islamist, regressive, backward, genocidal, maniac groups, and the Assad government is the multipolar, multicultural system. It was a socialist system. Unfortunately, it has changed a bit in the past 15 years. Assad wanted to reform the economy, and they want to change this entire political system there, and they want Syria to become another Lebanon, like a consuming country, just buying stuff, not producing, and exporting nothing good from Syria. And therefore, today we see the United States, they have troops in Syria, but they have no strategic goal. The United States doesn't have any strategic goal. They lost the war. What they're doing is only to deprive the Syrians from their natural resources. And by doing so, they're just using hunger game against the Syrian people in order to get concessions from the Syrian government. But if you study history just a little bit, and if you just read the history of the civil war in Lebanon and how the Syrian government was involved there between 1975 till 1990, when the civil war was over, and when it was over, Syria became victorious. But during this entire time, we had a lot of casualties. We had a lot of troubles inside and inside Syria through the Muslim Brotherhood and within Lebanon also. But the Syrian government follows the strategy of patience. We know that the Syrian people are suffering right now, but we're not going to make any concessions to the Americans. And we know that at the end of the day, Americans cannot afford to stay in Syria for a much longer of time. They could stay for another 1 or 2 years, but more than that, what's the strategy of the United States? What are they going to achieve? Regime change war has failed. Are they going to just steal the oil from Syria, $50 million per day? That's not a strategic goal for a country like the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to clear this up, because this is something a lot of people say, is like there's no way that someone like Bashar al-Assad could get 95% of the votes. But I mean, what I see, like on the ground, people filming and people sharing things that are happening on the ground, is a reflection of that. I see a lot of people on the ground celebrating. So I just want to ask you, how secure are Syria's elections? Like I said, like I see them on the ground celebrating, and not just for Assad, because they have like his picture and everything, but they're also celebrating their sovereignty, right?
Actually, I was surprised and shocked with the number of the people participating in the elections.
Wow.
Why? Because in 2018, we said militarily, the war is over. So the United States changed its tactic in Syria from a military warfare into an economic warfare. And Donald Trump has imposed very harsh, draconian sanctions on the Syrian people. And the Syrian people has become very angry because they're deprived of their basic necessities, basic needs, food, energy, electricity, even milk for their children. And the people started to say, look, to the Syrian government, we stood with you for all 6 years and 7 years and 8 years, because we knew there is an existential threat, and we knew there is a war. But now we want to see improvement. And what we see when the war is almost over, the living situation is deteriorating. So the people were really mad on the government. So I thought it was like, they're not going to participate in big numbers in this election. But the government has sent clear messages to the people that the war militarily is over, but economically, this is another level of war, that there are things that we can't really do. For example, the people are asking for fuel. We want to give fuel to the people, but what can we do if 50% of our gas and energy resources are occupied by the United States? And what can we do that we are importing gas and fuel from Iran, And while the ships are coming to Syria, once they were kidnapped by the Americans and the Brits, a few times were the Israelis tried to sink the tankers. So it's a really difficult also for the Syrian government, well knowing that even in Syria, Syria doesn't have any solid currency. We don't have dollars. We don't have euros left in our central bank, because also the United States is imposing harsh sanctions on any transactions of dollar or euros, and imposing harsh sanctions on the central bank of Syria. So all these components together has made the lives of the Syrians very hard. And despite that, the media messages and the political messages that the government sent, that things will change. It's not going to stay the way it is. We cannot back off now. We were fighting for 8 years and 9 years the military war. We cannot back off now from this economic war. And this is our plan: 1, 2, 3, 4. If you want to be with us, let's do it together. And what happened is, I mean, any government, they have also their propaganda tools, right? They mastered this. They convinced the people to participate in the elections, and we have seen, like, seriously, man, like, I've been watching videos in Latakia, Tartus, Aleppo, Damascus. These people are with millions. Millions of people participated in the elections. And don't forget that there are Syrians abroad, in the outside of Syria, like in Lebanon, like in France, like in Russia. All these people also participated in the elections. So I'm not saying at all that the elections in Syria is like in Switzerland again. But what we have seen underground was a popular will. The people were marching with millions to say, we're voting President Bashar al-Assad. Maybe many of them, they don't agree everything with Bashar al-Assad, but we want to send a message to the outside world, to the Western governments, that we will stick with our government until the end. We want to liberate our country from these contras and these foreign-funded terrorists. And when we liberate our countries, we can do political reforms and we can do economic reforms. This is our job, and it's not for America or for Paris or for London to say what kind of reforms shall we do in Syria. And what kind of reforms, like when the Americans talk about reforms in Syria, it makes me laugh. Do the Americans say to Saudi Arabia to do reforms? Do they say to Qatar to do reforms? Do they tell all these Gulf monarchies to do reforms, or it's only for these countries who oppose the American foreign policy in the region? So we know in Syria, these so-called reforms that the Americans are pushing for, they want to have the government and have the parliament to Guaido-minded and Navalny-minded people in Syria. I'm sorry, I don't want that democracy. If that's democracy, I don't want it, because it means a failed state. When you have these two conflicting powers that they differ 180% in ideology and political convictions, and when there is a voting on anything, it will be like Tom and Jerry. If this side says something, the other side will be the opposite. And this is the same what happens in Lebanon nowadays. There is the 8 March coalition and 14 March coalition. One side is pro-Syria and Iran. The other side is pro-the United States and pro-West. And see what happens there. Lebanon is a failed state. They can't even vote for the simplest things. If they want to import medicine in Lebanon, imagine that. There is a discussion now in Lebanon. They don't want to get Iranian medicine for free. Iran is giving them free medicine, and Iran gave them free fuel, gave them free electricity, free weapons, and the pro-American bloc in the parliament, they blocked it. They don't want to take anything for free from Iran, although they're dying right now because they have a lack of medicine. So do you really want that? No. Personally, I learned my lessons from Iraq. I learned my lesson from Libya.
Yeah.
And I don't want my country to be like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really simple. If you want to help the people, like how they claim, like, and they try to send in aid, then you just lift the sanctions. The same with all these other countries, like the blockade in Cuba. Lift that if you want to actually help the people, right? And then imagine what these countries could do without those sanctions. And another thing, like you were sharing on Twitter, like pictures of Assad meeting with the people, like going to some restaurants, going to weddings, and he's not like riding in like in the U.S. Like for example, presidents have to travel with like all this security and stuff, like these bulletproof limousines, right? So, you want to tell us a little bit more about that? How Bashar al-Assad goes and meets with the people?
People think that I'm making a propaganda. It's the normal thing even before the war. We used to see Assad in Aleppo at least one time per month. He used to come with the Lebanese ex-Lebanese president to have lunch in Aleppo, and people used to see them like cruising, walking in the street or with a car. They don't believe these things, but we have seen them, and nowadays it's the same. Like he took his oath, constitutional oath, and at night he took his family to Al Midan area. You know what's Midan area? Midan area is a very crowded area that even if it's like a popular shops that is open till midnight, and there would be thousands of people there. Even if you want to bring your security, your bulldozers with you, you cannot secure the security of the president. And just see one of the pictures of Assad inside of a shawarma shop, where when the guy is giving him a shawarma, there were two big knives just next to this guy who was serving them a shawarma, and these knives are for the cutting the shawarma. If someone hates him, he would just take the knife and kill him right away. And the opposition was using that, so-called opposition, of course, they were using this photo, saying that why didn't he kill the president? Why? Because you're living in illusion, thinking that the vast majority of the people hate him. Of course, there are people who hate him. There will always be people who hate politicians, and they're not saints. We need to understand Bashar al-Assad is not a saint. But during these circumstances, I would never abandon this guy. I would have said he's a traitor if he left power and left us face the tsunami of NATO alone. But he stood and he was steadfast with us during all this time. He was in his office when ISIS was 20 kilometers away from his office. So, of course, we appreciate this. We appreciate this bravery. We appreciate that he's a rational person. He understands geopolitics, and he understands his people, and he knows how to treat them. He goes also, I want to mention this because look at his family, man. He has 2 sons and 1 daughter. Like when you see them, how they're wearing, what do they dress? Very humble, no like fancy watches or boots. And when they meet people, their like hands are like this, as if they're shy. You see their body language, how they treat people with respect, my message is always like to other officials in Syria: learn something from Assad and learn how he treats the people and how his family are humble with the people. Because in Syria we have also a lot of officials, and especially their sons. They think if their father has become a minister or an MP or something, they start to have like big cars with black windows and bulletproof stuff they're wearing, as if they're a very important person, while the president is walking with his t-shirt in a popular place eating shawarma with the people,
Yeah, and I have that like in the thumbnail here. But yeah, for people who want to see those pictures, like Kevork shares them on his Twitter. So Syria is currently faced with illegal sanctions, which includes the Caesar sanctions. The Western powers in a UN Security Council support a resolution calling for the border crossing between Turkey and northwestern Syria to allow aid to cross battle lines, and Russia has vowed to veto this. So on July 6th, foreignpolicy.com wrote that, and I'm going to share this for people here. This is on their website here, foreignpolicy.com. They said, up for discussion today is a resolution drafted by council members Ireland and Norway that calls for keeping Bab al Hawa open, as well as reopening additional border crossing Al Yarubiya, and I might have botched that, sorry, on the Iraqi border
Yes,
to help aid
Yarubiya.
efforts in the Kurdish-held northeast. The discussion come as Syria's humanitarian situation has worsened over the past year. The UN World Food Program estimates 12.4 million Syrians are food insecure today, almost 60% of the population, an increase of 4.5 million people over the course of a year. Cross-border assistance, the WFP said, fulfills the basic needs of 2.4 million people in Syria, the majority women and children. So this is a common pattern I see regarding sanctions in general. The Western powers want to keep them while sending aid for optics. Is that what we are seeing here? And will this aid even help the Syrian people?
Actually, let's focus, for example, this border crossing of Bab al Hawa. This aid goes only to the rebel-held areas, okay?
Right.
They don't send any aid to the government-held areas, despite the fact that around 15 million people live under government-held areas and between 2 and 3 million people live in this rebel-held area. But all the focus in this rebel-held area, and of course there are many civilians and we need to help them. But there is a government in Syria. You cannot send an aid through Bab al Hawa border crossing because it's not in the hands of the government. The government said, you send this aid to Damascus and we distribute them even to rebel-held areas, and we have the Russian guarantor in this. But in the foreign policy article, there is a very big mistake. They say the West has to face Russia. No, the West has to face Syria. Russia was for opening Bab al Hawa border crossing, and Syria said no. And Russia is not an imperialist power in Syria. They don't occupy Syria. They cannot force Syria to accept this decision. So Putin sent a delegation to Syria to negotiate with the Syrian government over the border crossing. And the Syrians were like, if we're going to let this happen again, what's in exchange? What are we going to get from this? So it seems, this is not a confirmed information, but I have heard that the Americans have given some verbal guarantees to the Russians that they will decrease their presence in Syria and they will be withdrawal in the next few years. So based on that, the Syrians accepted this time to open this border crossing again, and for Russia not to use veto. Otherwise, we would have seen Russia vetoing this. The problem is for the West, they don't care about the civilians. This is a political theater. And if they care about the Syrian people, first they would lift the sanctions. And until today, and I was reading only 2 weeks ago on the European Union's Twitter account, they are lying with a straight face. And I don't say this with just because I want to say it on YouTube. They lie with straight face. They say these sanctions do not target the Syrian people. This is a BS for few reasons. One, who is the authority that secures the food, medicine, basic needs for the Syrian people? The Syrian government. Who want to secure this? If you sanction the Syrian government, then you are limiting the Syrian government ability to secure the basic needs for the people. This is one. Number two, the second BS is you are imposing sanctions on this Syrian central bank and its ability to make transactions. So imagine that Syria wants to buy, because our oil is occupied and our wheat is occupied by the United States in Syria. So we want to buy wheat. Okay? How shall we pay for that? How shall we pay for the money?
Right.
Are we going to put it on a donkey and let him walk to other countries? There is no transaction channels because it's all sanctioned. And if any company dares to deal with Syria and sell milk, 1 bottle of milk to Syria, this company will be sanctioned. So you're terrorizing any company to deal with Syria and then saying this is not this is a targeted sanctions. So I don't know, like, what is worse, It's the lie or the sanctions or both. It's really ridiculous how people buy this. When you go to Syria now, you will see Assad is not deprived from electricity. He has his gas and fuel. All the ministers and the officials are sitting under the air condition and happy. Who's paying the bigger price? The Syrian people. Do they really? Of course they know all this. So that is why these sanctions, the main goal of these sanctions is to create negative sentiments by the people against the government, because the government is incapable of securing the basic needs. And man, like today is summer and it's around 40 degrees, and in Syria it's like hell, 40 degrees. And you have like 4 or 5 hours electricity per day. Can you imagine your life like that? Just put yourself in their shoes. And during the winter time, when we don't have like minus 10 or something in Syria, but it's under 10, like it's 5, 4 sometimes, and it's bloody cold, and you don't have a gas and fuels for your heating system. Just put yourself in their shoes. So please go to Syria and see how the Syrian people are suffering because of the sanctions, and then tell me if these sanctions are targeted or not. And if you're gonna go on Twitter and make yourself an expert on Syria without going and talking, actually engaging with the Syrian people and listening to their pain, you don't have the right to evaluate these people. I've been in Syria in mid 2014 in Aleppo, when Aleppo was being bombed like every second. There was a rocket falling on our heads in Aleppo, and we don't have even electricity to charge our mobiles, and we were sleeping, me and other 2 journalists, and at 6:30 a.m. in the morning we heard people, and I'm gonna just act this what they do in Syria when there is a wedding or people are really happy. They do like people are really happy, you know. And we were sleeping, and all of a sudden I'm hearing like the entire Aleppo is like happy. What happened? Electricity for 30 minutes. For 30 minutes, we were like charging our mobiles fast. You know, just imagine this life.
And that's that we take that for granted a lot here in the US and the UK. We don't know how we torture these people like in these other countries with these sanctions. And then, you know, they like you said, they celebrate when there's like 30 minutes of electricity that are brought back during those hours that they have to have them off.
Yeah, I will tell you another story. When I was in Aleppo, I was in Al-Midan area, and Al-Midan area was on the forefront. It's like separating between the rebels and the government. And I'm standing like on a street just to take some shots, and somebody comes like, sorry, sir, don't stop here. Yesterday, a mortar fell here and somebody died. I say, okay, I go to the other street, and somebody other comes, please don't stop here. 2 days ago, a mortar fell here, and the boy, 4-year-old boy, died. Wherever you stand, people have memories and telling you yesterday and the day before somebody died there. And this is a kind of life for Syrians. This is the democracy and the revolution that they brought for the Syrians. Syria was one of the safest places on earth before the war. You could have taken a bag of dollars with your hand and walk in the street. Nobody could dare to say anything to you. Now you can't even walk in a street. So people, even though some of them were enthusiastic about the so-called revolution because the propaganda was very huge, it affected the people's minds. But the people, when they experienced the revolutionary experience, their neighborhoods were occupied by these rebels, their streets have been bombed by these rebels. They were like, no, we don't want this life, man. We are a moderate people, we are secular people, although we are Muslims, for example, in Aleppo, but we don't like your strict Sharia laws. We don't want to be forced to go for prayers. We don't want to be to wear like a strict dress code. We want our women to go to school. We want our women to go to university, because under the rebel areas, you're not allowed to do any of this. Women's place is in the kitchen. This is what they teach, and you have to cover your entire face like an entire burqa. No, this is not the Syria that we used to know. Of course, you can see a lot of women wearing hijab in government held areas. That's not the point. But closing her face entirely and dealing her as if she's some sort of in Arabic they say aura. Aura means like you are. I cannot control my hormones, my masculine hormones, if I see a non-covered face woman. This is how they treat them. Like they objectify them, they sexualize them, they oppress them. No, this is not democratic values. You have your opposition to the Syrian government, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that you have to praise for these radical Islamist terrorist groups in Syria.
Yeah, and I want to play this clip because, again, I have you on here to inform the audience and to debunk some of these talking points that some of these people, such as this individual who I'm going to show just in a bit, are saying about Syria and how they're defending Americans being in Syria. They're defending imperialism and regime change for wars for oil. So I'm going to let this play and then I'll get your thoughts on this.
You're right. There is a problematic brand of so-called anti-imperialism, which will only zone in on atrocities committed directly by Western imperialism.
I'm going to be honest with you.
I agree, but you're right. But there's a nuance, isn't there? A kind of,
Oh, there is nuance. I'm just completely black-pilled on the legions of online anti-imperialist leftists because I found almost all of them are Assad defenders. Which I have no respect for, having recently encountered them and realized the extent of their conspiracism. A lot of them, by anti-imperialist, what they actually mean is that they're anti-American, and not in the cool way, by the way. I'm anti-American in the way that I think that America, the institution, the nation, has failed its people. There are ways we could use our wealth and power. We are not. We're using them poorly. We're using them to hurt people. I'm anti-American because I want America to be better. They're anti-American because they've just found other countries to defend. Mostly, it seems Russia. That they seem to buy into this just another set of geopolitical power interests. And if that's the case, then your criticisms are illegitimate because at that point it's just team sports. It's not a real substantive leftist critique of America. It's just you fall in line with a different, and in this case, probably further to the right, set of geopolitical interests, which is deeply, deeply disappointing. Anti-imperialism is simple in concept but complicated in action. Was it anti-imperialist for America to pull its troops out of eastern Syria and leave the Rajavan population to their own, knowing they would be gobbled up by Assad and by Turkey? I would consider that a pro-interventionist perspective. They were our allies, and we allowed imperialism to take place by no longer stationing our troops there. They were allies to us, and a socialist project as well, the Rajavans. They were doing something extraordinary.
All right. Yeah. So that was really hard to listen to, but I mean, we have to debunk that.
my heartbeat's already increased.
It was like every second he was saying something ridiculous. But yeah, go ahead.
I really don't know which point I should reply first. Okay. First of all, Syria and Russia, in the sense, they are in the position of defense in Syria. It's not the Russians who launched a war in Syria. It's not Assad who launched a war in Syria. It was the United States who launched a regime change war. And this is all now documented. And thanks to the WikiLeaks, we have a lot of documents that we can prove this. So saying that you are defending Russia by asking these the American troops to leave Syria is the most ridiculous thing, because Americans are an occupation force and there is international law. When there is there is either international law or not. So if there is an international law, then the Americans are not invited. They're not being called, so their presence is illegitimate in Syria, and they have to leave. So, regardless what titles and how they try to sugarcoat this idea, legally they are illegitimate. Secondly, Russian presence in Syria is legitimate because it's been called by the Syrian government and it's been voted for the Russian forces to come and fight the terrorists. And three, there is an illusion that if the American forces leave, then the Kurdish population will be exterminated. This is a BS. Kurds are an integral part of the Syrian population. I am Syrian, but I'm Armenian. They are Kurds, but they are Syrians. This is what they don't understand. So Syria has over 20 different ethnicities, religious sects, etc. And it is not okay for any religion or any ethnicity to occupy an area and say, this is mine. Firstly, this so-called Kurdish-held area, the vast majority of the population there, they're not Kurdish. The Kurds consist of 30% of the areas that they control, but they control with force because the American forces have given them, like they trained them and given them arms and ammunition, etc. And the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces are basically more or less are the YPG. And the YPG is a Kurdish militia, right? And if we go back in 2011 and 2012, it was the Syrian government who was giving weapons, ammunition, and support to the YPG and the Kurdish militias to fight against these so-called rebels, to defend themselves against the Al-Nusra Front, and later to defend themselves against ISIS. So there is no coexistence problem between the Syrian government or the Syrian people and the Kurds. There is a political problem that is based on the separatists among the Kurdish people. So I'm very careful with my wordings. Only the separatists who want to divide Syria, and they want to take the eastern shores of the Euphrates, the geography which consists of all of Syrian wheat, and 50% of Syria's oil and gas resources. And they consist of 30% in the area that they occupy. So overall in Syria, if they are, I believe, around 10% or something, they want to take Syria's half of treasures, right? And it's not logical to give just one ethnicity a piece of cake. And what about the other ethnicities? Do we have a national state or not? If it's not, then the Kurds will have a piece of cake. The Armenians want a piece of cake. The Alawites want, the Shiites want, the Sunnis want. Then what do we have? 100 years ago, Sykes and Picot came, the French and the British mandates, they came and divided the Levant into Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and then they have given 3/4 of the Palestine also to Israel. They have already divided the Levant. Do you want to divide it? Federalism, in a sense, it's important if it unites the divided. If it's a federalism between Syria and Lebanon, it's fine. If it's federalism between Syria and Iraq, it's great. But it's when you want to divide the divided through federalism, that's, of course, you are creating an entity like Israel in an area, and you're creating a hostile environment for yourself by trying to steal the natural resources that belong to the entire population, to 24 million. That if there is a 24 million Syrians and 1 million of them are Kurds, shall they get 50% of the Syrian oil resources? Of course not. And there is another important point. They say that all Kurds want Rojava, etc. This is also another BS, because if you go to Aleppo and you go to Damascus, there is a big Kurdish community, and they don't behave the same way the separatists behave in the eastern shores of the Euphrates. And also there is a big there's a big number of fighters among the Kurdish separatists. They're not even Syrians. They came from Kandil, they came from Iraq, they came from Turkey. They are people who were persecuted by Erdogan, by Saddam Hussein, and they came refugees in Syria. And the Syrians, of course, they embraced them. But if you came as a refugee, you cannot ask this geography as part of your land. I'm a third generation refugee in Syria. My ancestors survived the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Empire. So let's suppose, do you think that it's okay for the Armenians to call for their state now in Syria? Because they have in a town called Kesab, we are the vast majority there. Kesab is an Armenian town. Imagine one day Armenians say, we want to have Kesab for ourselves, and we have also like the Mediterranean in front of us. So it would be a very nice destination like Cannes or Nice, right? But that won't happen. Armenians are very patriotic in a sense that they really belong to Syria, and they preserve their Armenian identity, and they treat Syria as their motherland and Armenia as their fatherland. So you can combine both. Identity is not something that it's static. You can really develop your identity through time. You can, because of the human experiences, because of the historical experiences, you enrich your identity. And I say I'm Syrian of Armenian descent, Armenian origins. And when I go to Armenia, I feel like my body is having bruises. I feel like this is my ancestors' country, but I defend Syria with my teeth, and I would not abandon it.
And he also brought up Russia. But if Russia hadn't gone into Syria, then wouldn't ISIS and al-Nusra, al-Qaeda taken over Damascus? Like, wouldn't that have happened like really fast?
There is a possibility, of course, that if Russians didn't intervene, they would have been advanced for ISIS into Damascus. And the proof of that is a leaked audio of John Kerry when he was meeting with opposition figures it seems in Washington, and one of them was actually recording his conversation secretly, and then WikiLeaks published this audio. Kerry was clearly saying in 2015, it was in August 2015 or July 2015, that we knew that ISIS is Daesh. He says Daesh is advancing from Palmyra to Damascus, and they were like 20 kilometers away from there, and we allowed them to advance to Damascus because we wanted to practice pressure. I'm not quoting exactly, but this is the context. We wanted to practice pressure on Assad for him to compromise. So they used the expansion of ISIS against Assad for him to compromise. But I mean, Syria was targeted into very, very difficult warfare, and the Syrian army is a regular army. It's not used to fight guerrilla warfare. During these 10 years, it's been trained, but before that, at the beginning, it was very difficult to adapt in this new warfare techniques. So that's why Syria called for, I don't want to mention the name directly, it's the Yellow Flag Party from Lebanon to come, because we will be blocked on YouTube, the Yellow Flag Party to come into Syria, the Lebanese party. They called Iran. Iran doesn't have fighting forces. They're more advisors. But the Lebanese they had between 5 to 20,000, depends like the period and the battle. But the Russian intervention was essential in a sense because even our MiGs and Sukhois have been gunned down many times. They have now anti-aircraft Iglas that they can shoot the helicopters and stuff. So the Russian intervention was essential, and it was President Bashar al-Assad and it was Qasem Soleimani who convinced Putin to intervene in Syria. And they brought the map and they showed him what's the map of control and everything. There is a very good documentary about it on Al Mayadeen Lebanese television. And they elaborated that the intervention of Russia would increase the leverage of Russia in the international community, and it will give him like as if it's a gate for Russia also to have a bigger say in the Middle East and abroad. And what happened. But it's very important. This is I want to repeat it once again. Russia in Syria is not an occupation force, and I know this for sure, and I have friends who are diplomats who were in regular meetings with the Russian side. The Russians call Assad, they say he's the stubborn ally. He's a tough ally. This is what they say about Assad. everything is being proposed by Russia to Syria should be negotiated like in details. For example, Russia proposed to Syria to change the constitution and to give more decentralized powers to the Kurdish to the Kurds in the eastern shores of the Euphrates. And this has been like for 2 years negotiations between Syria and Russia. And at the end, the Syrians refused. Why Syrians refused? As I mentioned at the beginning, Syria under Assad, they play like they're very patient, and they play on time, and they know that the circumstances will change. And at the beginning, you start negotiating, and you know that after 2 years, the circumstances will be different, and it's different now. The former envoy, the former ambassador of the United States in Syria, Ford, and the former envoy, special envoy of the United States in Syria, James Jeffrey, they all said now for the Kurds, we are going to withdraw sooner or later, and you have to be, you're not going to have your federal state or any independent entity. So they have to deal with the Syrian government, because the alternative is Turkey. If they don't cooperate with Syria, then they will be occupied by Turkey. And their experience with the Syrian government is good. I mean, what right the Kurds want? Like what right that I have the Kurds don't have in Syria? They have more rights than I have. For example, me as an Armenian, I am constitutionally not allowed to participate in presidential elections. In Syria, the president should be a Muslim, okay? In 1973, when Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, he tried to change the constitution in 1973, and he proposed the constitution to the People's Assembly, and he said, I want full secular system. Any Syrian can participate in the presidential elections. And what happened is the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and the Islamist forces in Syria, they mobilized their forces and they wanted to fight against the government. So the government retracted this draft and said, okay, it stays the way it is. It stays like the president wants to be a Muslim. I do a lot of lobbying and pressure on social media about this article. It's the article number 3 in the Syrian constitution that says Syrian president should be a Muslim. Like a few days ago, when President Assad he took his oath, he was swearing only on the Quran. Like, I don't agree with that. Syria is not an Islamic state, right? Syria is the birthplace of Christianity too. So there should be a secular state. This is my humble opinion. But especially now after this second rebellion of the Islamists against the Syrian government, I think it is impossible, because the Islamists are a fact. And every time you try to change and try to modernize your country, they are a very regressive force that the only way that they can react is through force. So you don't want to really provoke them anymore. Mm-hmm. So the Kurds can participate in the election. Any Kurd can be a candidate as a president, and I am not.
Yeah, Kevork, there's so much more I would love to talk to you about, especially the Armenian and Azerbaijan history and conflict that's happening, which I haven't talked about on my channel yet, but I would love to bring you back on to talk about this if you have some time, like later on. But I appreciate you coming on, educating my audience, and thank you for all the work that you do.
I'm happy to be your guest, and I will happily, of course, be your guest again when you want about Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I don't make compliments, my friend, but I'm really thankful for the work you do, and I'm really thankful that there are people like you who are open-minded and they are open to listen. This is very important for us to communicate and expand this circle of people, because we are spreading knowledge at the end of the day, and the knowledge that we are spreading is in the favor of establishing peace. We're not advocating for wars. We're not advocating for regime change wars, and we're not advocating for war criminals who have killed already millions in the past decade. So people like you, their channel should be boosted, and we have to increase our cooperation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So where can people find your work? Where can people find Syrian analysis, and where can people find your Twitter and all that?
I think it's written here, Syrian Analysis. I wrote it the way it is written on YouTube. Mostly I post the videos on YouTube under Syrian Analysis. Also the Twitter is the same. The Facebook is the same. My name is Kevork Almassian. I don't know if we can maybe write it under your description of the video later.
Yep.
But most importantly is the videos that I post on Syrian Analysis.
All right, Kevork Almassian, thank you very much for being on the show. And to the audience members, thank you guys very much for watching. And don't you forget, what's most important is to stay informed. Take care, everybody.